Purity Night was an honor student who returned home to Mississippi in 1997 to attend university. She had spent the past several months traveling, first to Oregon and later to Israel, trying to get away and find herself after her sister's death in 1995. Unfortunately, her return home would lead her to the same fate, after being kidnapped and buried alive that spring. Her case would be documented as it unfolded on the website crimescene.com, where it reached a significant audience. Most notably, Corey Taylor, the vocalist of the band Slipknot, was so moved by the story that he would make reference to it in 2 of the tracks on the band's self-titled major label debut. However, the story's inclusion on the album would wind up putting the young band's future in jeopardy. So for this episode of Tales from the Internet, let's take a look at the story of Purity. This video is sponsored by Mischief. I look at Mischief and I see a brand that's kinda like all about discovering the rare treasures of the world. They're behind a lot of products and events that I heard of before, and I had no idea they were actually the company behind it. For example, the Jesus shoes. Filled with holy water from the River of Jordan. A lot of you probably saw Mr. Beast's finger on the app game. That was also Mischief's doing. And then there's the Cuss collar, which yells out a curse word every time your dog barks. I'm not gonna lie, I wish they would have sent me one of those, because I want it. And I can't even find it for resale, so I guess that's just like gone. Every 2 weeks, Mischief has a new drop, and most of the time they sell out within minutes, if not seconds. That means if you want any of these rare drops, you're gonna need to download the Mischief app. And when you have the app, in addition to the bi-weekly drops, they also occasionally have exclusive drops that you can only get on the app. Like, if there comes to be a day where I release my own jars, or release my own things to contain in the jars, it would probably be in collaboration with Mischief. All I know is that I'm kinda salty right now that I'm not wearing the Jesus shoes as I do this promo. So I'm definitely not gonna miss out on the next drop, and neither should you, so just go click the link in my description and download the Mischief app. That's MSCHF. Oh yeah, and they have a feature where you talk to a random employee, so be sure they know I sent you. Look at this drawing from Dave Correa back in the days of the Slipknot vs. Limp Bizkit feud. I found that while researching this video, and honestly it has nothing to do with the topic, I just thought it was cool and it kinda took me back to a place in time. I used to see this drawing all the time on Slipknot fan sites, and I used to look at a lot of them because Slipknot was just like that important of a band for me when I was growing up. Like, that was my band. When that self-titled album came out, I hadn't heard anything like that before. That was the album that made me want to play in a band, an album that I would sit there and dub cassette tapes to give to my friends, even though, I probably shouldn't have done that, but I did it anyway. So when I saw that there was a Digipack re-release of the album with even more tracks, I got that as soon as I could. Shout out to Sam Goody. Then I came home with it and I realized there's something kinda weird about it. 2 of the original tracks were missing. Tracks 8 and 9, Frail Limbs Nursery and Purity. Frail Limbs Nursery was just like a short interlude track with this creepy electronic sound and this haunting woman's voice talking. That track transitions into Purity, which is a song about a woman buried alive in a box. So I want to find out what's going on with these missing tracks, so I go on a bunch of different Slipknot fan sites, and I cannot understate how many Slipknot websites there were back in the day, many of which still actually exist and might make for a good Angel Fire stream. And on these websites, people are breaking down different Slipknot lyrics, trying to analyze them, my favorite of which is probably Eyeless. You can't see California without Marlon Brando's eyes. People had so many deep, allegorical explanations for what these words could possibly mean, and then it just turns out that it was something that Corey Taylor, the band's vocalist, heard a homeless guy say once and he thought it sounded cool. And then you have Prosthetics, which turns out to be a song influenced by the movie The Collector. Not the one that, came out after the album came out, the original one from the 60s. And as for the song Purity, well, this winds up being probably the most interesting of them all. You see, Purity relates to this old story that Corey had seen on the website crimescene.com. The kidnapping and murder of Purity Night. At the time, this case was being investigated by Detective Anderson and Detective Armstrong of the Yonapatawpha Police Department. Purity Night was the sister of Valerie Wilson, another girl from that county who had been murdered in 1995 and whose story was also covered by crimescene.com. After the murder, Purity moved to Oregon to attend Reed College. Then she moved to Israel as her interests changed before ultimately returning back to Mississippi to go to university there. That return would ultimately spell her doom. In March of 1997, Purity reported a stalking incident at her home. Unfortunately, the police weren't really able to do anything about it, and days later, she disappeared. It quickly becomes clear this was a kidnapping as the culprit begins to taunt her family and the police with creepy answering machine messages, torn pieces of maps, a ransom note, and ultimately Polaroid pictures of Purity being held captive in some sort of box. So the detectives do the obvious thing: consult the users of the website to help them solve the case. They fill the website with all of the evidence, all of the clues, and real player interviews with witnesses and people associated with the case. And they added comment sections so people could discuss the case and ask detectives any questions they had. The internet, of course, was very helpful. Did you look at the retardation center? I don't think they call it that anymore. Oh wait, it's literally what it's called on the map. The suspect may have a family member that is a professional photographer. He may be using their Polaroid. Ah yes, Polaroids, the professional photographer's first weapon of choice. Hey, what if we use the website to trick the culprit? Well, I guess it's too late now that you said it on the website. Unfortunately, despite the best efforts of the internet sleuths, Purity Knight was found dead on June 9th, 1997, buried alive in a homemade coffin less than a mile from her home. She was given food and air through a secret passageway and kept alive for months. And what was more tragic was her nearly successful escape attempt. That July, after noticing some drawings by a 9-year-old, Dylan Hull, of what appeared to be the crime scene, a camp counselor contacted the sheriff's department. Upon investigation, it was discovered that the boy had come across Purity while she was still alive. She asked him to bring her some pens and paper, and when he returned with them, she wrote this note. Dave, I thought it was some kind of sick game, but now I'm going to die. If you can't do something, I know I will die. I am badly hurt. Please come and let me out. Dylan, the boy, can help you. Just come and let me out and we can talk. Hurry. Purity. This note, however, never made it to the police. On his way out of the woods, the boy was confronted by a strange man. The man convinced Dylan that he would deliver the note for him, but that note never made it to the police and ultimately was discovered tucked inside of a library book months later. On one of his visits, the boy also brought with him a toy tape recorder and got some audio of Purity speaking. This is the audio that's sampled on Slipknot's Frail Limbs Nursery. Ultimately, the trail of crumbs led to Ed Pierce, Purity's roommate's boyfriend who also attended the University of Mississippi. The police found irrefutable evidence that he was the culprit behind her kidnapping and ultimate death. And after a gunfight that sent Detective Anderson to the hospital, Ed was apprehended and put behind bars. It's a hell of a story, and I can understand why Corey felt so moved by it. So Slipknot's self-titled album comes out, and they really start to blow up very quickly. I remember them just in the course of a few months, opening up for Cold Chamber, and all of a sudden they're the band, headlining fucking everywhere. I remember being at school and there were so many of us wearing Slipknot shirts that some guy that didn't know the band asked us if Slipknot was some kind of brand. Then that digipack with the extra tracks comes out, and it seems like such an obvious move because it's like Slipknot Champion Edition. But then the regular version of the album is re-released, this time also missing the same tracks, Purity and Frail Limbs Nursery, and it's apparent that something's going on here. Well, as it turns out, crimescene.com had an issue with these songs. You see, they believed that Slipknot was infringing on their copyright. Copyright? How do you copyright a murder? What would the Yonapatawpha County Sheriff's Office have to say about this? Wait a minute, where exactly is Yonapatawpha? Yonapatawpha County, pronounced is a fictional Mississippi county created by the American author William Faulkner, largely based upon and inspired by Lafayette County, Mississippi, and its county seat of Oxford, Mississippi, which Faulkner renamed Jefferson. Faulkner often referred to Yonapatawpha County as my apocryphal county. So wait, does that also mean this gray person isn't a dead body? And this is not a page from People magazine? And this guy isn't a professor? Wait a minute, what's going on here? Is it real? Proving the reality of crime scene evidence files is something best done in a separate forum. Enter your email address to get a set of URLs describing the reality contained in these web pages. So the answer to whether or not this is real is just not yes. And really, the more you look at it, the more obvious it is that this is some kind of ARG, or more accurately, the internet version of one of those old mystery novels. The way the clues are curated in such a way that kind of begs the reader to solve the mystery. The way the public was invited in to interact with the detectives almost in like a 20 questions kind of way. How they would announce scheduled updates. I mean, in reality, murder mysteries don't really have a schedule. But all that being said, even if the songs were inspired by a fictional story, in my non-professional opinion, that still wouldn't make it copyright infringement. I mean, yeah, it's more complicated because they use the sample in Frail Limbs Nursery, but for purity, just using the character's name and some plot points that really are plot points that have existed in other stories before this one just doesn't seem like enough to me. But if I'm wrong, Veil Amaya needs to be real fucking careful. And this was reported a bunch of different ways at the time. Some sites said that the songs were removed as a preventive measure to keep the band from getting sued. Others said that the band did in fact get sued and they lost and they had to remove the songs as a result of it. But the truth, as it turns out, is a little bit different from both of these accounts. There doesn't appear to be any online records of the actual court proceedings regarding this case, but Corey Taylor clarified what happened during a Q&A session at one of his speaking engagements.
Basically, my fucking answer was, well, that song's been around for fucking 5 years. And now all of a sudden you're coming out of the woodwork saying that we ripped you off, which was horseshit, by the way. And that's why we got it back. We got that fucking song back eventually because we won. And I was very proud of that.
He goes on to describe a day where he gave testimony about this to a judge over the phone. The judge laughing as he describes what's going on in the lyrics. And he clarified that the actual lyrical content of the songs existed before he heard about the Purity story. Those lyrics were inspired by the movies Boxing Helena and The Collector. He insists that he only took the name of the song from the website. Ultimately, it turned into an ordeal where the case went to a bunch of different courts, and in the meantime, it was put on what he described as a temporary restraining order. Basically, either the band had to take the album off the shelves completely, or they just had to get rid of those two songs. It's a pretty obvious choice, thus the digipack and the re-release. And ultimately, Slipknot did win in the case of Purity, however there has been no official release of Frail Limbs Nursery to this day. Purity, however, did appear for the first time since this controversy in 2005 on their 9.0 live album. And the studio version of the song returned on the 10th anniversary release of their self-titled album. As for crimescene.com, it actually still exists, and they now go through much greater lengths to make sure that everyone playing along with the mysteries knows that these are in fact works of fiction. But despite that, in the book Slipknot Inside the Sickness, Corey explains that in a way, he still feels like the story is real. I still think it's real. See, the thing, whether it's true or not, it's a real story that we read about, that fucked our whole world up. Can you imagine a girl being buried in a box and having all this lecherous bullshit drip down on her from this guy, and thinking that there is hope because this kid is taking some bizarre note to this guy he doesn't even know, thinking that you are holding on to the shirt of hope, and you wake up and you're dead and buried in the mud? They find a note about a week later shoved in a library book, for God's sake. It just hurts your head. It's a case of what is good and bad in people. The box alone is reason enough to be like, I can't stand to be fucking human. How could someone fucking do this to somebody? What is inside of us that is so fucking wrong? He had written quotes from Edgar Allan Poe and lots of fucked up things on the box. Ultimately, although this was undoubtedly a massive pain in the ass for the band at the time, it wound up being a piece of lore that made the band's story that much greater, and made sure that the band was intrinsically tied to the early internet. And although honestly Purity has never been one of my favorite Slipknot songs, I have to say that it's been stuck in my head the entire time I've been working on this video. So you know, good thing they won and I've just been listening to the thing over and over again. But anyway, that's all for now. If you like this video, you'll also like my video about the guy who impersonated Dream Theater's Mike Portnoy in order to rob people. I'm out.